Picture this: a dark, tangled forest in 19th century America, where the air is thick with the scent of pine and the weight of oppression. In one night, 10 powerful men vanish in a blaze so fierce it leaves nothing but whispers and ash. This isn't just a story of fire. It's a tale of genius, grief, and a man who turned his pain into a perfect act of vengeance. Welcome to a forgotten chapter of history, a story so raw and gripping, it'll haunt you long after the screen fades to black. Buckle up, because you're about to step into the world of Ezekiel and his fiery revenge. In 1858, in the dense, pine-laden wilderness of Bladen County, North Carolina, 10 men in positions of absolute power were erased from existence in a single night. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't a chaotic uprising. It was a quiet, methodical, and perfect act of annihilation. A single fire that bloomed in the heart of the forest and left behind nothing but ash, bone fragments, and a question that still haunts the shadowed corners of that land. The official record calls it a tragic accident, a cautionary tale about the dangers of drink and fire in the volatile world of turpentine production. But the whispers that have survived for over a century tell a different story. They speak of a man named Ezekiel, an enslaved worker who was a ghost in their machine, a silent observer who possessed a mind they could not fathom and a pain they could not measure. They say he devised a revenge so precise, so intimately familiar with the physics of fire and the chemistry of suffering, that he turned the very system that enslaved him into a flawless instrument of cremation. 10 overseers, the petty kings of this remote timber empire, went into a cabin for a night of cards and whiskey. They locked the door from the inside, and they were never seen alive again. But this isn't a story about a simple act of vengeance. It's about how a man stripped of everything, his name, his freedom, his family, can transform grief into genius and suffering into a science. To understand how he did it, you have to understand the world that created him. A world built on the sweet, suffocating perfume of pine resin, a kingdom of isolation, where the only law was the will of the men who were about to burn. The turpentine camps of southeastern North Carolina were a world unto themselves. Forget the sprawling cotton plantations you see in movies with their grand houses and relative proximity to civilization. This was something else entirely. This was a raw, primordial industry carved directly out of an endless ocean of longleaf pine. For hundreds of miles, the land was a monotonous, beautiful, and terrifying expanse of trees. And deep within this wilderness, operations existed like isolated colonies on a hostile planet. The work itself was a form of slow, methodical torture. Enslaved hands would spend their days carving deep V-shaped wounds, they called them boxes, into the base of pine trees. The sticky amber lifeblood of the tree, the resin, would slowly weep into these boxes. Workers would then return day after day, scooping the thick gum out with long-handled dippers, their skin and lungs permanently coated in the vaporous, cloying scent. Each worker was responsible for thousands of trees, walking miles through snake-infested undergrowth in the humid, oppressive heat. But the physical labor wasn't the most dehumanizing part. It was the isolation. These camps were often 25 or 35 miles from the nearest town, creating fiefdoms where the overseer's power was absolute, unchecked by law, by society, or by the distant plantation owners who leased their human property for a profit. The system was a masterpiece of detached cruelty. A man like Ezekiel legally belonged to an owner named Elias Thornton. But Thornton was just a name on a ledger. The men who controlled his every waking moment, the men who held the power of life and death over him, were the 10 supervisors of the Bladen turpentine operation. They were not wealthy planters. They were something far more dangerous. Poor white men who had been granted godlike authority over those even lower on the social ladder than themselves. And they had built their own private economy in the shadows of the forest. An enterprise of theft and cruelty that would ultimately fuel the flames of its own destruction. Who were these 10 men? History barely remembers their names except as a list on a death record. James Carver, Ezekiel Holt, Benjamin Marsh, Caleb Grayson, Jonah Tate, Amos Reed, Gideon Wells, Thaddeus Kane, Levi Porter, and Isaiah Vance. To the world, they were middlemen, managers in a brutal but legitimate industry. But in the forest, they were a cabal, a 10-headed hydra of petty tyranny, bound together by a shared secret. You're not supposed to know this, but their real business wasn't just turpentine. It was theft. They had perfected a scheme, a shadow ledger that ran parallel to the official one. By systematically underreporting the amount of resin, tar, and rosin their sections produced, they created a surplus, a secret inventory of naval stores that they sold on the black market through contacts in Wilmington. The money, a small fortune by their standards, was split 10 ways. It was a conspiracy that required absolute loyalty, enforced by mutual self-interest, and the certainty of shared ruin if any one of them ever talked. This hidden power system made them untouchable. They answered to no one. Their cruelty was not just a product of their station, it was a tool of their trade. Fear ensured silence. Pain ensured compliance. James Carver was famous for his whip, a length of braided leather he treated like an extension of his own arm. Ezekiel Holt preferred psychological games, threatening to sell a worker's child if a weekly quota was missed by even a single barrel. They had created a perfect, self-contained ecosystem of exploitation, a world where the official rules no longer applied. And at the heart of this dark kingdom was Ezekiel. He was 34 years old, a quiet, lean man whose hands were permanently stained the color of old amber. They called him a premier hand, a master of his craft who understood the forest better than anyone. But what they never knew, what they couldn't know, was that he was watching them. He was learning. And in a world designed to keep him ignorant, he had taught himself a forbidden skill that would become the architect of his revenge. He had learned to read. Before the fire, before the rage was forged into a weapon, there was Sarah. In the brutal calculus of slavery, where human beings were assets and relationships were liabilities, their bond was an act of defiance. They were married in the way the enslaved could be, without a legal document, without a church's blessing, but with a commitment that ran deeper than any law. Sarah was 28. She worked in the communal cooking shack, a place of constant heat and meager rations, but her laughter could cut through the thickest despair. She was the anchor of Ezekiel's world, the single point of light in the suffocating darkness of the camp. And in the spring of 1857, more than a year before the fire, she was 6 months pregnant with their first child. Can you imagine that? To dare to bring a new life into a world that promises it nothing but bondage. To love so fiercely that you believe you can carve out a space for hope where none is meant to exist. Their love was a quiet rebellion, a universe of two built in the heart of a system designed to atomize human connection. Every stolen moment, every shared glance, every whispered promise in the dark of their small cabin was a victory against the men who owned their bodies but could not touch their souls. Or so they thought. The 10 supervisors, however, saw this love not as a testament to the human spirit, but as a vulnerability, a lever, a pressure point to be exploited. And one Thursday evening in April, Isaiah Vance, the cruelest of the 10, the man who served as the group's de facto leader, decided to test the limits of that vulnerability. It began, as so many tragedies do, with a man who believed he had the right to take whatever he wanted, and a woman who had the courage to say no. That evening, Ezekiel returned from the forest, his body aching from the day's labor, to find the cooking shack strangely silent. Sarah was gone. The other women wouldn't meet his eyes, their fear a palpable thing in the smoky air. Finally, an older woman named Martha took him aside, her voice a dry whisper. Isaiah Vance. He took her to his cabin an hour ago. The supervisor's cabins were forbidden territory, a small cluster of structures set apart from the workers' quarters, representing a border that was never to be crossed. But Ezekiel crossed it. He didn't run. He walked with a purpose that terrified the few who saw him, a man moving toward a destination from which he knew there might be no return. As he approached Vance's cabin, the last light of day bleeding from the sky, he heard voices. Sarah's voice, high with panic, and Vance's, thick and slurred with whiskey. The rest of the story is pieced together from the whispers that followed, a mosaic of fear and awe. Some say Ezekiel shattered the door with a single kick. Others say he found it unlocked and slipped inside like a specter. But everyone agrees on what he saw, Sarah cornered, her dress torn at the shoulder, and Isaiah Vance advancing on her, a drunken, predatory grin on his face. What happened next was not the act of a slave. It was the act of a husband. Ezekiel moved with a speed born of pure rage, striking Vance with a closed fist. The supervisor, a large man but clumsy with drink, stumbled backward, crashing over his own table. For a single, breathless moment, the only sound was the splintering of wood and the ragged gasps of the two men. Then Vance rose, blood trickling from his lip, and his grin was gone, replaced by a look of cold, murderous clarity. "You just signed your own death warrant, boy," he hissed. Ezekiel grabbed Sarah's hand, and they ran. Not toward freedom, for there was no such thing, but into the deepening twilight of the forest, an instinctual flight from a horror they had only for a moment delayed. Their flight was short-lived. They barely made it back to their own cabin before they were caught. It wasn't just Vance. 7 of them came, their faces illuminated by the flickering demonic light of pine knot torches. They dragged Ezekiel out into the central clearing, and what followed was not just a punishment. It was a piece of theater, a carefully staged lesson for every other enslaved person in the camp, a demonstration of what happened when property dared to act like a person. All 10 supervisors were present now, forming a silent tribunal. They tied Ezekiel to the whipping post, a permanent fixture in the clearing, and James Carver stepped forward, uncoiling his famous whip. 50 lashes. Each one laid open the skin on his back, but the physical pain was a distant thing, an abstract sensation compared to the agony of watching Sarah being forced to witness it, her screams muffled by the hand of another supervisor. But the real punishment came after the whipping was done. As they cut him down, barely conscious, Ezekiel Holt addressed the silent, terrified crowd. "This one's got too much spirit for his own good," he announced. "Mr. Thornton will be informed he's been sold deep south, and the woman goes with him. Sold south." It was a death sentence. The sugar and cotton plantations of Alabama and Georgia were notorious killing fields, where the life expectancy of a new worker was measured in months, not years. For Sarah, pregnant and now traumatized, the journey itself would likely kill her. It was in that moment of absolute despair that Amos Reed, the youngest of the 10, offered a different, more refined cruelty. "Hold on," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I've got a better idea. We need hands for the new operation out west by the Cape Fear River, swamp country. Nasty work. Why don't we send him there alone? We keep the woman here, let her work off his debt. That way he spends every day wondering if she's safe, knowing that if he ever steps out of line again, she's the one who pays the price." The other supervisors considered it. The genius of the cruelty was immediately apparent. Selling them was simple. This was art. It was a form of psychological torture that would last a lifetime. They would sever the bond, but keep the connection alive as a perpetual threat. Ezekiel would work in the most brutal conditions imaginable, 45 miles away in a malarial swamp, motivated not by the whip, but by the constant, gnawing fear of what would happen to his pregnant wife if he failed. It was agreed. As they dragged him toward a wagon, Levi Porter leaned in close, his breath hot and sour in Ezekiel's ear. "You should have just let Isaiah have his fun," he whispered. "It would have been over in 5 minutes. Now you get to live with this forever. Was it worth it, boy?" Ezekiel didn't respond. His back was a landscape of fire, his wrists raw from the ropes. But as he was thrown into the wagon, he did something that none of them understood. He looked at each of the 10 men one by one, meeting their eyes with a gaze that was not broken, but unnervingly clear. He was memorizing their faces. He was etching their features into his mind with the precision of an artist, though he didn't yet know he was composing a death mask. The wagon carried him into the darkness that very night. He was allowed one brief supervised visit 3 weeks later. He found Sarah gaunt, her spirit eroded. She told him in rushed, frantic whispers about the 18-hour workdays, the reduced rations, the way Isaiah Vance made a point of walking past her just to remind her of his power. "The baby?" Ezekiel asked, his voice cracking. "Is the baby all right?" "Still kicking," she whispered, a flicker of defiance in her hollow eyes. "This child knows its father is fighting for us." It was the last time he ever heard her voice. The swamp near the Cape Fear River was a place where hope went to die. The turpentine operation there was smaller, more primitive, an outpost of misery in a landscape that seemed actively hostile to human life. The pine trees grew twisted and stunted from the waterlogged soil, yielding less resin and demanding more work. The workers stood in knee-deep stagnant water for hours on end, the air thick with mosquitoes that carried fever and snakes, cottonmouths that dropped from the branches overhead like venomous fruit. Men sickened and died from mysterious ailments, their bodies simply giving up under the strain. But for Ezekiel, this place was not a prison. It was a laboratory. Stripped of everything he loved, his grief began to calcify, transforming into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly patient. He stopped feeling and started observing. He began to study the fundamental nature of the substance that defined his world, turpentine. He learned that its vapors, invisible and nearly odorless, were heavier than air. He watched them pool in low-lying areas, a hidden, explosive sea waiting for a spark. He saw it happen once. An overseer lit his pipe too close to a storage shed, and the world disappeared in a flash of white-hot ignition. The man's scream was consumed by the roar of the inferno before it even had a chance to register. Ezekiel filed this observation away. He learned that burning resin could not be extinguished by water. He saw a small fire in a collection vat turn into a river of liquid flame when men threw buckets of water on it, spreading the fire instead of dousing it. Another observation logged in the silent ledger of his mind. And he learned about the smoke. The smoke from burning pine resin was not like normal smoke. It was thick, black, and oily. It didn't just obscure vision, it suffocated. It filled the lungs with a toxic tar that could kill a man long before the flames ever reached him. He was a student in a dark university, and the curriculum was death. He didn't have a plan yet. He only had pieces, fragments of a puzzle he didn't know he was solving. He was simply learning the language of his enemy. 3 months into his exile, a new worker named Jeremiah arrived from the main camp. He brought news, and the news was the spark that would ignite the kindling of Ezekiel's dark education. Speaking in hushed tones after the overseers were gone, Jeremiah told him what had happened to Sarah. She had lost the baby. A supervisor, Jonah Tate, had ordered her to lift a massive iron cauldron of boiling water. Despite her advanced pregnancy, despite her pleas that it was too heavy, Tate had threatened her with starvation if she refused. She had tried to lift it. She felt something tear inside her. She collapsed. The baby, a boy, was born still 2 days later. They didn't even let her grieve, Jeremiah whispered, his voice choked with rage. They had her back in the cooking shack 3 days later, said she was using her sorrow as an excuse to avoid work. Ezekiel received this information in utter silence. He was standing in the swamp, the setting sun casting a blood-orange glow across the black water. In that moment, something inside him did not break. It was perfected. The grief, the rage, the pain, they were fused together, cooled, and sharpened into a single unyielding point of purpose. He asked Jeremiah only one question, his voice unnervingly calm. "The 10 supervisors, do they still hold their monthly meeting at Vance's cabin?" Jeremiah nodded. "First Friday of every month. They drink and play cards until dawn." Ezekiel said nothing more, but the puzzle pieces in his mind began to snap into place. The vapor, the liquid fire, the suffocating smoke, the 10 men, the isolated cabin, the first blueprint of his fiery revenge was beginning to take shape. From that day forward, Ezekiel became the perfect slave. He was a phantom of compliance. He exceeded his quotas, never complained, never met an overseer's gaze with anything but vacant deference. His performance was so convincing that it earned him small privileges, an extra piece of cornbread, the permission to mend his tools by the fire after the others were asleep. He used these stolen moments not for rest, but for study. He scavenged discarded newspapers, not just for the words but for the ideas they contained, for the glimpses they offered into the white man's world of commerce, law, and science. He was building an arsenal of knowledge, preparing for a war only he knew he was fighting. 8 months after losing his son, His model behavior paid off in a way he had calculated. He was transferred back to the main operation. The official reason was that he was rehabilitated. The real reason was a labor shortage. He arrived to find that Sarah was gone, sold 3 weeks earlier to a plantation in Georgia. The supervisors had deemed her melancholy and unproductive since the loss of her child. They had sold her for $80, pocketed the money, and told Elias Thornton she had run away. This was the final piece of the puzzle. It confirmed that their corruption was absolute. They were not just cruel, they were thieves, betraying even their own masters. They operated with a sense of total impunity, and it was this arrogance, this belief in their own untouchability, that Ezekiel would use against them. He now had nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. His objective was no longer just to punish them for Sarah. It was to obliterate their entire world, to erase their conspiracy from existence, and to do it so perfectly that no one would ever know it was anything but an act of God. Ezekiel began his true work. He was no longer a laborer. He was an intelligence agent operating deep in enemy territory. He used his position as a premier hand, a position that granted him more access and inspired less suspicion, to map out the supervisor's entire criminal enterprise. He learned to read their ledgers, not just the words, but the numbers, the flow of goods, the subtle discrepancies. In stolen moments, when a supervisor's cabin was empty or a record book was left unattended, he would slip in, his mind a camera, memorizing columns of figures. He discovered the precise mechanics of their theft. They were skimming 20% off the top of all production. It was the perfect number, not so large as to trigger immediate alarms from the plantation owners, but large enough to generate a substantial illicit income over time. The stolen barrels were hidden in secret caches throughout the vast forest, later transported by a discreet wagoner to buyers on the coast, who conveniently asked no questions. But his greatest discovery was the key to their entire conspiracy. He found their secret ledger. Isaiah Vance, the man who had started it all, was also their bookkeeper. In a moment of drunken carelessness, Vance left his cabin unlocked. Ezekiel slipped inside and found it. A thick, leather-bound book hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It contained 8 years of meticulous records. Every stolen barrel, every illicit sale, every dollar divided 10 ways. It was their ultimate insurance policy against each other, a document of mutually assured destruction. It was also the proof that could hang them all. But Ezekiel knew with cold certainty that simply revealing the ledger would accomplish nothing. The word of an enslaved man against 10 white overseers, it was meaningless. He would be killed for his audacity, and they would, at worst, be dismissed. No, the ledger was not a tool for justice, it was a target. And the men who wrote it were the fuel. Justice wouldn't come from a courtroom, it would come from a crucible of his own design. His plan began to crystallize around the supervisor's monthly ritual. The first Friday of every month, they would gather at Isaiah Vance's cabin, the most isolated of the supervisor's dwellings, nearly a mile from the nearest workers' quarters. They would lock the door, shutter the windows, and drink themselves into a state of oblivious camaraderie. They believed their isolation kept them safe, that the locked door protected their secrets. Ezekiel would turn their fortress into a tomb. He needed 3 things: a significant quantity of highly flammable accelerant, a delivery system that was both invisible and delayed, and a personal alibi that was irrefutable. The accelerant was all around him. As a premier hand, he was sometimes involved in the distillation process, which separated crude pine gum into rosin and the highly volatile spirits of turpentine. This was the equivalent of pure gasoline. Under the guise of his duties, he began to steal it, ounce by ounce. He would fill a container for an official task, but hold back a tiny amount, hiding it in small clay jars he buried throughout the forest. It was a slow, painstaking process, a deadly harvest that took weeks. Each hidden jar was a prayer to a vengeful god. The delivery system was the true mark of his genius. He couldn't just splash the turpentine around. That would scream arson. The fire had to appear to have started from within, a tragic accident born of their own carelessness. He needed a bomb with a timer, but a bomb made of materials no one would ever question. He remembered something he had read in a discarded newspaper, an article about experimental incendiary devices, mentioning the slow, heat-generating reaction of certain chemicals when exposed to air. He had no access to exotic chemicals, but he had matches, which contained phosphorus. He had linseed oil, used to treat barrels, and he had the resin itself. He began to experiment in the deepest, most remote parts of the swamp. He discovered that a tightly packed bundle of rags soaked in a mixture of turpentine spirits and linseed oil, combined with sulfur from matchheads, would begin to slowly oxidize when exposed to a controlled minimal amount of air. The oxidation generated heat, slowly, invisibly, until it reached the point of spontaneous combustion. He had created a delayed fuse, using nothing but the everyday materials of his enslavement. The final piece of his masterpiece was the alibi. It had to be perfect, placing him miles away under constant supervision at the exact time the fire would occur. He volunteered for the one duty everyone else dreaded, night watch at a distant collection point. The job required a worker to stay awake all night guarding the processed barrels of turpentine. The overseer in charge of that section, a man named Tobias, was notoriously diligent, known for making multiple unannounced checks on his night watchman. It was the perfect stage. He would be 3 miles east of Vance's cabin, a silent, dutiful sentinel, while 3 miles to the west, his creation was ticking toward its violent birth. But one colossal problem remained. How could he get his incendiary devices inside the locked, guarded cabin? How could he position them for maximum effect without being seen? The answer came from the heavens, or perhaps the abyss, in the form of a casual conversation. He was speaking with old Jacob, not the supervisor, but an elderly enslaved man who sometimes acted as a servant for the overseers. Jacob mentioned that Vance had ordered him to stack a full cord of firewood inside the cabin before the next meeting. "Says they want a real blaze going all night," Jacob grumbled, "to keep the March chill out. Firewood stacked inside the cabin, right next to the massive stone fireplace. It was a delivery system sent by fate itself." "That's a heavy job for one man," Ezekiel said, his voice a careful mask of sympathy. "Do you need help?" The old man's face lit up with relief. "Would you? Vance wants it done the day before, stacked up neat, right by the hearth." It was done. On Thursday, March 4th, 1858, Ezekiel would personally deliver the Trojan horse into the heart of the enemy's fortress. The stage was set, the actors were oblivious, and the author of the final act was preparing his instruments. The day before the meeting, Ezekiel unearthed his hidden jars. He had prepared 3 separate incendiary devices, tripling the odds of success. He had fashioned small, crude clay pots, firing them in the operation's kiln under the pretense of making a bowl for his food. Into each pot, he packed the soaked rags, the sulfur, the volatile resins. He sealed each pot with a clay lid, leaving only a single pin-sized hole to allow for the slow ingress of air that would begin the chemical reaction. He then coated the outside of the pots with dirt and ash, disguising them to look like forgotten, worthless junk. They were bombs that looked like trash. That afternoon, he and old Jacob loaded a wagon with firewood and drove it to Vance's cabin. The supervisor was there, impatient and arrogant, watching them work. "Stack it tight against that wall," he ordered, gesturing toward the area beside the huge stone fireplace. "And don't be all day about it." As they worked, moving back and forth from the wagon to the cabin, Ezekiel executed his plan with the calm precision of a surgeon. With each armload of wood, he carefully placed one of his clay pots into the stack. The first went near the bottom, nestled deep within the wood, close to where the radiant heat from the fireplace would be most intense. The second he placed halfway up the stack, ensuring a second, more explosive ignition once the fire was already established. The third he tucked in behind the entire stack, against the dry wooden wall of the cabin itself. But he wasn't finished. He had one more layer of destruction to add. He remembered the physics of turpentine vapor, how it was heavier than air, how it would pool on the floor like an invisible, explosive gas. As they finished the stack, he accidentally stumbled, dropping a large armful of logs. In the brief moment of chaos, as Vance cursed him for his clumsiness, he used a small, sharpened piece of metal to puncture 2 of the pots he had just hidden. The spirits of turpentine, thin and volatile, began to slowly, silently weep out, soaking into the surrounding logs and the floorboards below. The faint, sweet smell was indistinguishable from the normal odors of the turpentine operation. It would go completely unnoticed. "Get out!" Vance snapped once they were done, "and close the door behind you." As they drove the wagon away, Ezekiel could feel the silent mechanism he had set in motion. The slow oxidation had begun. The clock was ticking. Friday, March 5th, 1858. Ezekiel spent the day working as he always did, his movements measured, his expression unreadable. Inside, his mind was a storm of calculations and anxieties. What if the pots ignited too early or too late? What if one of the men noticed the faint smell and became suspicious? Every passing hour was an eternity. At 4 p.m., he reported for his night watch duty. The overseer Tobias personally escorted him to the collection point, a clearing 3 miles east of Vance's cabin, where barrels of finished turpentine were stored before transport. "You know the rules," Tobias said, his face stern in the fading light. "I catch you with your eyes closed. You'll feel the lash before you're fully awake." "Yes, sir," Ezekiel replied, his voice steady. "I'll keep a good watch." As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Ezekiel sat by his lantern, the picture of a dutiful slave. In his mind, he was tracking the movements of his targets. The supervisors would be arriving at Vance's cabin now. They would be greeting each other, opening the first bottles of whiskey, lighting the fire in the hearth. The fire would begin to warm the cabin, and in turn, it would begin to warm his hidden devices, accelerating the chemical reaction within. And all the while, the invisible vapor would be pooling on the floor, a silent, deadly tide rising around their feet. At 8:15 p.m., Tobias made his first check. He appeared from the darkness like an apparition, found Ezekiel awake and alert, and grunted in satisfaction before disappearing again. All was quiet. At 9:45 p.m., a faint scent reached Ezekiel on the night breeze. It was smoke, but in a turpentine forest, the smell of smoke was constant. He forced himself to remain still, to betray nothing of the storm raging within him. What if it wasn't his fire? What if something had gone wrong? At 10:20 p.m., Tobias returned, his stride more urgent this time. "You smell that?" he asked, sniffing the air. "It's getting stronger. Smells like pine, but heavy, coming from the west." "I noticed it a little while ago, sir," Ezekiel said, his tone carefully modulated to sound mildly concerned. "Figured it was just a cook fire from one of the other sections." "No," Tobias said, his eyes scanning the western horizon. "That's too much smoke for a cook fire. Way too much." He stood there for a long moment, hesitating. A sense of unease was creeping into the night. "You stay put," he finally commanded. "Don't you move from this spot. I'm going to go see what in God's name is going on over there." He plunged back into the forest, heading west toward the source of the smell. Ezekiel remained seated by his lantern. He did not move a muscle. He was a statue carved from shadow and patience, but his heart was a war drum. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and then he saw it. Through a gap in the trees, a flicker of orange. It wasn't the small dancing light of a torch. It was a fierce, angry glow that pulsed against the blackness of the night sky, growing brighter with every second. It was the color of the sun, the color of judgment. Soon shouts could be heard in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder, laced with panic. The forest, which had been filled with the gentle sounds of the night, was now waking to a symphony of alarm. The beast he had created was finally loose. An hour later, which felt like a lifetime, Tobias stumbled back into the clearing. He wasn't alone. He was with 2 other men, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes wide with a horror that seemed to have permanently seared itself onto their expressions. "It's over," Tobias said, his voice a hoarse, broken thing. "The watch is over. There's been an accident." "What happened, sir?" Ezekiel asked, pitching his voice to convey the perfect blend of shock and obedient curiosity. "Vance's cabin," Tobias choked out, shaking his head as if to deny the image in his own mind. "It's gone. It burned to the ground. The supervisors, they were all inside." He couldn't finish. He didn't have to. The unspoken truth hung in the smoky air between them. All 10. Ezekiel allowed his face to register the appropriate horror. All of them? But how? We don't know, one of the other men stammered. The fire. It was like nothing I've ever seen. It went up like a powder keg. The door was barred from the inside. The windows shuttered. By the time anyone got there, the whole cabin was a roaring furnace. There was no getting in and no getting out. As they made their way back to the main compound, the western sky was still a terrifying, vibrant orange. Ezekiel knew exactly why it had burned so hot, so fast. He had designed it to. The initial ignition from the pot near the hearth would have started a conventional fire, but one that was already feeding on turpentine-soaked logs. As the men scrambled in the smoke-filled darkness, confused by drink, the other two devices would have ignited, creating a multi-point inferno. And then the pooled vapor on the floor would have found a spark. The result would have been a fuel-air explosion, a concussive blast of fire that would have instantly consumed all the oxygen in the sealed cabin, killing the men by asphyxiation even before the flames touched them. It was a perfect, inescapable trap, engineered with the dispassionate precision of a god. The next morning, the official investigation began. Simon Caldwell, the overall manager of the turpentine operations, arrived from Lumberton, along with Elias Thornton and several other plantation owners. What they found was a scene of apocalyptic devastation. The cabin no longer existed. It had been reduced to a blackened, smoking crater, with only the stone chimney standing like a grim monument to the dead. The bodies, or what was left of them, were unrecognizable heaps of carbon and calcified bone. The heat had been so extreme it had warped metal and cracked stone. The initial conclusion was swift. It had to be an accident. A stray spark from the fireplace must have ignited the massive stack of firewood Jacob and Ezekiel had delivered. The men, drunk on whiskey, had been too slow to react. The locked door and shuttered windows had sealed their fate. It was a tragedy, yes, but a plausible one in an industry built on flammable materials. Elias Thornton, Ezekiel's legal owner, stood by the ruins shaking his head. "A terrible, terrible loss," he muttered, though his tone was more concerned with logistics than with human life. "This will cost us dearly. 10 of our best men gone in an instant." But Simon Caldwell wasn't convinced. He was a shrewd, observant man, and the scene before him felt wrong. The sheer intensity of the destruction bothered him. It suggested a powerful accelerant, and as he walked the perimeter of the char he noticed something else. The burn pattern was inconsistent. There wasn't one single point of origin. There were at least 3 epicenters of extreme heat. One near the fireplace, yes, but also one in the middle of the foundation, and another against the back wall. It looked less like a fire that had spread and more like a fire that had erupted from multiple places at once. His gaze swept over the assembled workers, and it settled for a moment on Ezekiel. He called him over. "You delivered the wood?" "Yes, sir," Ezekiel replied. "Me and old Jacob." "Did you see anything else? Anything out of the ordinary?" Ezekiel met his gaze without flinching. "No, sir. Just an empty cabin. Mr. Vance watched us the whole time. We did as we were told." Caldwell held his gaze a moment longer, searching for something, a flicker of deceit, a hint of a lie. He found nothing. Ezekiel's alibi was ironclad. Tobias had vouched for him completely. He had been 3 miles away, under guard. It was impossible. Caldwell turned away, but the seed of doubt had been planted. This was no accident. This was an execution. Caldwell's doubt drove him to dig deeper, not into the fire itself, but into the affairs of the men who had died in it. He began a quiet, private audit of their production records, comparing their reports to historical yields from their sections. He found discrepancies, small at first but consistent, a pattern of underreporting that stretched back for years. The truth, however, came not from his own accounting but from the ashes of the cabin itself. Sifting through the debris, a worker found a metal lockbox. It was warped and melted, but had protected its contents from the worst of the flames. Inside, charred around the edges but miraculously legible, was Isaiah Vance's secret ledger. Caldwell took the ledger back to his office and read it by candlelight. And the full scale of the supervisor's conspiracy, was laid bare. 8 years of systematic theft. Names, dates, amounts. It was all there. The discovery placed Caldwell in a terrible bind. If he revealed the ledger, he would be exposing a massive fraud that had happened on his watch. The plantation owners would hold him responsible. His career, his reputation, everything he had built would be destroyed. He might even be accused of being a co-conspirator. But if he destroyed the ledger, he would be burying the truth, protecting the legacies of 10 thieves and becoming a liar himself. Caldwell made his choice. A week later, a small accidental fire broke out in his own office. It was quickly extinguished, but tragically, a stack of old records, including the lockbox and its contents, were reported to have been destroyed. The official story of the 10 supervisors remained unchanged. They were hard-working men who had died in a terrible accident. They were buried together in a common grave, eulogized as victims of fate. Ezekiel had not only killed them, he had unwittingly forced the system to erase their crimes, purifying their memory even as he had purified their bodies in fire. The irony was as perfect as the crime itself. In the aftermath, the power dynamics of the camp shifted. New supervisors were hired, outsiders who were monitored with a new level of scrutiny by the now paranoid plantation owners. For Ezekiel, life resumed its monotonous rhythm. But he was a changed man. He moved through his days like a ghost, the fire inside him now banked to a cold, patient ember. The rage was gone, replaced by a profound and hollow emptiness. He had balanced the scales. He had repaid every lash, every threat, every moment of agony they had inflicted upon Sarah and their unborn son. But vengeance, he discovered, was a sterile and lonely victory. It could not bring back his wife. It could not fill the void her absence had left in his soul. 3 months after the fire, Elias Thornton sold him, not south, as he had once feared, but to another turpentine operation in eastern North Carolina. It was a simple business transaction, a reassignment of an asset. As he was preparing to leave Bladen County forever, the old woman Martha approached him. She was one of the few who looked at him with an understanding that went beyond words. "I heard a whisper," she said, her voice barely audible. "A trader passing through had news from Georgia. He spoke of a woman named Sarah on a rice plantation near Savannah, owned by a family called Wentworth." She held his gaze. "I don't know if it's true, but it's a direction." Ezekiel processed the information without a flicker of expression, but inside him, something that had been dead for over a year stirred. Sarah was alive. She was in the rice swamps of Savannah, a place almost as deadly as the turpentine forests, but she was alive. He now had more than a memory to hold on to. He had a destination. "Thank you," he told Martha. She nodded, a deep sadness in her old eyes. "I don't know what justice was served in that fire," she whispered, "but I hope it brought you peace." "Peace was never the price," Ezekiel replied, his voice quiet but clear. "It was the payment." The new plantation near New Bern was more of the same, yet fundamentally different. The work was identical, but the suffocating atmosphere of Bladen County was gone. The new supervisors were wary, the system more transparent. Here, Ezekiel was just another skilled hand, a quiet, efficient worker with a history no one cared to investigate. But he was no longer just going through the motions of survival. He had a new purpose. The name Wentworth and the city Savannah became his secret mantra, the coordinates of a new life he barely dared to imagine. For 2 years he worked, and he listened. He became a collector of information, piecing together a map of the South from the conversations of traders, the gossip of other workers, the discarded newspapers he found. He learned about the routes, the patrols, the geography of escape. He knew that reaching her was a statistical impossibility. A lone man traveling hundreds of miles through hostile territory, trying to find one specific person on one specific plantation among thousands. It was a fool's errand, but the fire had taught him that the impossible could be engineered. In the fall of 1860, the world began to change. Whispers of war between the North and South grew louder, and with the tension came chaos. And in chaos, there is opportunity. One afternoon, a slave trader arrived at the plantation. This was not unusual, but his request was. He presented documents to purchase 4 specific workers, one of whom was Ezekiel. The price he offered was well above market value, an offer Ezekiel's owner, a man driven by profit, could not refuse. Within days, Ezekiel was shackled in the back of a wagon heading south. This felt like a cruel twist of fate, a journey not toward Sarah, but toward the deeper hell of the Cotton States. He had traded one form of bondage for another, and was now moving in the wrong direction. But he was wrong. On the 3rd night of their journey, camped deep in the woods along the border of Georgia, the trader approached him. He unlocked Ezekiel's shackles. "You can run now, and I won't stop you," the man said, his voice low. "Or you can stay and listen." Ezekiel, stunned into silence, stayed. "Who are you?" he finally asked. "The name doesn't matter," the trader replied. "What matters is that a message from an old woman named Martha found its way to the right people. She said there was a man in Bladen who paid a debt for many, and that he needed to get to Savannah." Ezekiel stared at the man, his mind struggling to comprehend. This trader, this supposed instrument of the slavery system, was something else entirely. "There's a network," the man explained. "Not as organized as some people think, just people helping people. Martha put your name into the system. It took 2 years, but we found you. This sale is your ticket out." He pressed a small folded piece of paper into Ezekiel's hand. On it was an address, the Wentworth Plantation. "This is a real sale for the other 3, the trader continued, his voice all business. "I have to make this look legitimate. But you get off the wagon at the next crossroads. There are people waiting. They'll get you closer. But the last leg of the journey, finding her on that plantation, that part is on you. If you get caught, we never met. This conversation never happened. Understand?" "Why?" Ezekiel asked, his voice raw. "Why do this for me?" The trader looked at him, and for the first time, Ezekiel saw a flicker of something other than mercenary calculation in his eyes. "Because Martha said you were a man who knew how to balance a ledger. She said, 'You earned this, now don't waste it.'" The next morning, as the sun rose, the wagon stopped. The trader pointed down a small, unmarked path leading into the forest. "Follow that for 3 miles. You'll find a farm. Ask for a woman named Eliza. Tell her you're the man from Bladen." Ezekiel stepped down from the wagon, a free man for the first time in his life, though his freedom was fragile and contingent. He looked back at the trader, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. 2 men on opposite sides of a brutal system, momentarily united by a hidden current of resistance. Then he turned and walked down the path into the unknown, a ghost leaving one life and heading toward the ghost of another. The path led him into a world he never knew existed, a secret geography of safe houses and hidden routes, a fragile web of connections spun in the darkness, a network that would come to be known as the Underground Railroad. It was a system built on breathtaking courage and trust, operated by free blacks, sympathetic whites, and enslaved people themselves. Eliza, the woman at the farm, was a free black woman who used her business, selling produce to plantations, as the perfect cover to move people and information. She hid Ezekiel for 3 days, feeding him, giving him new clothes, and passing him on to the next station, a Quaker farmer who believed slavery was a sin against God. For a month, Ezekiel moved like a phantom through the backwoods of Georgia. He traveled by night, hiding in root cellars, barn lofts, and hidden compartments. During the day, he learned to wear different identities like a change of clothes, a runaway, a hired hand, a free man with forged papers. Each stop was a lesson in the quiet, tenacious nature of rebellion. This was not the fiery, explosive justice he had delivered in Bladen County. This was a different kind of power, patient, resilient, and built on the radical idea of shared humanity. Finally, in December of 1860, he arrived on the outskirts of Savannah. The Wentworth Plantation was a vast, sprawling rice empire. Finding Sarah here would be like finding a single grain of rice in a harvest. He spent a week in the woods bordering the plantation, studying its rhythms, its routines, its vulnerabilities. He learned that extra hands were hired for the final harvest. Posing as a laborer from a neighboring farm, he walked onto the plantation, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope so intense it was a physical pain. He was a ghost walking back into the machine, risking everything on the faintest whisper of a rumor from 2 years ago. He spent 3 days working in the rice paddies, a brutal, back-breaking labor that made the turpentine forests seem forgiving. He was bent over in knee-deep muddy water, cutting rice stalks with a sickle, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He scanned the faces of every worker he saw, searching for the one he had memorized, the one that was etched onto the inside of his soul. And then he saw her. She was walking along a dike at the edge of the field, carrying a wooden bucket of water for the workers. She was thinner, and the easy laugh he remembered was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, weary resilience. But it was her. It was Sarah. Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the field, the shouts of the overseer, the buzzing of insects, it all faded into a dull roar. He straightened up, and across 100 feet of mud and water, their eyes met. For a moment neither of them moved, locked in a gaze that bridged 3 years of hell. Then the water bucket slipped from her grasp, splashing at her feet. She took a step, then another, and then she was running, stumbling through the shallow water, her eyes never leaving his. He met her halfway, and as his arms closed around her, as he felt the impossible solid reality of her in his embrace, the weight of the 10 bodies he had turned to ash, the miles he had traveled, the risks he had taken, it all collapsed into this single sacred moment. "You found me," she whispered into his chest, her voice choked with tears. "How? How did you find me?" "I never stopped looking," was all he could say. Around them, the other workers had stopped, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. They were witnessing a miracle, a testament to a love that a brutal system had tried and failed to extinguish. But even in the embrace, they both knew the truth. This was not an ending. It was a stolen moment, a temporary reprieve before the reality of their world came crashing back in. That night, they met in the suffocating darkness of the slave quarters. They talked for hours, their voices low and urgent, trying to compress 3 years of life and loss into a single conversation. Ezekiel told her everything. He told her about the swamp, about his dark education in fire, about the plan, and about the night the cabin burned. He told her about the 10 men. He expected shock, perhaps even fear. Instead, he saw in her eyes a flicker of the same cold, hard clarity he had felt when he first learned of their child's death. "They deserved it," she said, her voice devoid of pity. "They deserved that and more. You did what no law, no God would ever do for us. You gave them justice." Her words were an absolution he didn't know he was seeking, but their reunion was a paradox. In finding her, he had placed them both in mortal danger. He told her about the network, about the possibility of escaping together, of reaching the north, of living as free people. He spoke of a future he had barely allowed himself to dream of. But Sarah, her face etched with a wisdom born of profound suffering, gently shook her head. "Running is for the young and the whole," she said softly. "I am neither. This place, this work, it has taken too much from me. I would not survive the journey. And if we were caught together, they would make an example of us that would be sung about in cautionary tales for 100 years. Then I will stay," Ezekiel said, his voice fierce. "I will find a way to be sold here. I will work beside you and die beside you. In 5 years," she countered, her hand on his cheek. "The rice paddies are a graveyard, Ezekiel. You didn't come all this way just to die in a different swamp. You paid for your freedom with fire. Don't throw it away." They were trapped in an impossible choice, a life together in bondage or a life apart in freedom. By dawn, they had made their decision, a decision that was both a testament to their love and a final, heartbreaking act of sacrifice. They had 5 more days, 5 days stolen from the jaws of a merciless system. They lived a lifetime in those days, in fragmented conversations, in shared meals of scraps, in the silent understanding that passed between them in a single glance across the field. They existed in a bubble of time, acutely aware of its fragility. For 5 days they were not just a slave and a fugitive, they were a husband and a wife. Ezekiel told her about their son, the boy he had never seen, and she told him about the brief, painful moments of his life, giving him a memory he could hold on to. He learned that in the wake of the fire in Bladen County, the story had spread through the slave communities like wildfire, becoming a myth, a legend of a faceless avenger who had brought down the wrath of God on the wicked. No one knew his name, but his deed had become a source of secret, dangerous hope for thousands. He had become a ghost story told by the living about the justice they craved. On the 6th morning, long before the sun rose, they walked together to the edge of the plantation, to the place where the cultivated fields met the wild, untamed marshland. This was as far as she could safely go. "You live free, Ezekiel," she whispered, her hands framing his face. "You live for both of us. Every breath of free air you take, I will feel it here. Your freedom will be mine. That is how this has to be." They held each other one last time, a final, desperate embrace against the coming dawn. Then, without looking back, Ezekiel turned and melted into the shadows of the marsh, heading north. He was walking away from the only person he had ever loved to claim the freedom she had just purchased for him with her own life. He never saw her again. What became of Ezekiel? The official historical record is silent. He vanishes, as so many did, into the great unwritten chronicle of those who sought freedom. His story fractures into rumor and possibility. One account, a letter from an abolitionist in Boston, speaks of a quiet, intelligent man from North Carolina who went by the name of Freeman, working in a lumber yard, a man with a deep, haunting sadness in his eyes and hands that seemed permanently stained. Another oral tradition, passed down in a community of black loyalists in Nova Scotia, Canada, tells of a man who arrived in the early 1860s, a man who spoke little of his past, but knew more about the chemistry of fire than any man they had ever met. Perhaps he made it. Perhaps he found a life of quiet anonymity, a ghost in a new, freer world, forever haunted by the wife he had left behind and the men he had sent to their graves. Or perhaps the swamp, the patrols, or the simple brutal odds of the journey claimed him, his body never found, his story ending in the same wilderness that had forged his revenge. But the historical fact remains. On March 5, 1858, 10 men were consumed by a fire so perfect in its execution that it was deemed an accident. Their conspiracy of theft died with them. The legend they left behind was one of tragedy, not of villainy. The truth was buried, not just by Ezekiel's cunning, but by a system that found it more convenient to believe in an accident than to confront the possibility that its own property could harbor a mind capable of such magnificent, terrifying intellect. The deepest secrets are often hidden in plain sight, disguised as misfortune. And what of the world he left behind? The turpentine industry continued, brutal and profitable, until the Civil War tore its economic foundations apart. Elias Thornton died a wealthy man, never knowing that one of his assets had orchestrated the deaths of 10 of his employees and exposed a fraud he never even knew was happening. Simon Caldwell took his secret about the ledger to his grave, a man who chose self-preservation over a truth that would have upended his world. The names of the 10 supervisors are carved on a single weathered headstone in a forgotten cemetery, their shared grave, a silent testament to a lie that has held for more than a century and a half. But history is not only what is written down, it is also what is remembered. The story of Ezekiel, or the fireman as he was sometimes called, became a part of the folklore of the region. It was a story told in whispers, a cautionary tale for cruel overseers, and a parable of divine or demonic retribution. It was a story that proves that even when you erase a man's name, you cannot always erase his actions. The fire itself became a historical footnote, a data point in the long and dangerous history of Naval Stores production. But for those who know the whispers, that footnote is a monument. It marks the spot where one man, armed with nothing but his grief and his intellect, declared war on his entire world. And for one single brilliant night, years later, long after the war had ended and the world had irrevocably changed, a journalist from the North was traveling through Georgia, collecting the stories of the formerly enslaved. He interviewed an old woman named Sarah, who lived in a small cabin on the land where she had once been property. She spoke of her life, of the brutalities of the rice fields, and of the husband she had lost long ago. The journalist, intrigued, asked what had become of this man, Ezekiel, The old woman looked out toward the horizon, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "I believe," she said, her voice soft but certain, "that he found his freedom. One way or another, I believe he found it. And that is all the ending to the story that I have ever needed to know." She would say no more on the matter. She understood that some stories are not meant for the clean, sterile pages of official history. Their power lies in their ambiguity, in the spaces they leave for us to fill with our own sense of justice, morality, and awe. Her husband had become a myth, and a myth is more powerful than a man. A man can die, but a story, if it is told well, can burn forever. The truth is not always a set of facts. Sometimes the truth is a fire that cleanses, a story that endures, and a love that chooses freedom over presence. Today, the great pine forests of Bladen County are still there. The turpentine industry is a ghost, but the trees remember. If you walk deep enough into the woods, you can find ancient longleaf pines that bear the scars of that era. Faint, V-shaped marks, healed over by more than 150 years of bark, like wounds that have closed but never disappeared. And if you have a map and a great deal of patience, you can find the ruins of Isaiah Vance's cabin. There is not much left. A handful of foundation stones half buried in pine needles and earth, and the defiant, crumbling chimney stack, still standing guard over a patch of ground where an impossible act of justice was carried out. Standing there in the deep silence of the forest, you can almost feel the weight of the story. You can almost smell the smoke on the wind. It is a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It is not even past. It is a living thing, breathing in the quiet places, waiting for someone to listen. This story was never just about one man's revenge. It was about the collision of two kinds of power: the overt, brutal power of a system built on oppression, and the hidden intellectual power of a mind that refused to be broken by it. Ezekiel demonstrated that the most effective weapon against a corrupt system is a perfect understanding of how that system works. He used its own elements, its isolation, its materials, its arrogance, to engineer its downfall. He did not break the machine, he simply allowed it to consume itself. This case forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question about the nature of justice. What is justice in a world where the law itself is unjust? The 10 supervisors were thieves, abusers, and dehumanizers, yet they operated entirely within the protection of the law of their time. Ezekiel, in acting as their judge, jury, and executioner, committed what would be defined as a mass murder. Yet in the moral landscape of his world, was his act not a form of profound, almost biblical justice? It suggests that there are certain equations of suffering that cannot be solved by conventional morality. There is a dark arithmetic of retribution, where an act of terrible violence can, in some contexts, feel like the only possible balancing of the scales. Ezekiel's fire was not just an act of rage. It was a philosophical statement, written in ash and bone. It was a declaration that when all legitimate paths to justice are closed, a man will carve his own path with whatever tools he has at his disposal. And sometimes the only tool that is sharp enough is fire. But was the ledger of Ezekiel's soul ever truly balanced? Or does a debt paid in fire only create a new one, owed to the darkness itself? He won his revenge, and he may have won his freedom, but he lost the one person for whom he did it all. He was forced to walk away from Sarah, to carry the memory of her as both a comfort and a wound for the rest of his days. Perhaps that was the final, most refined cruelty of the system he fought against. Even in victory, it exacted a price that could never be repaid. The story of Ezekiel is a glimpse into the terrifying potential that lies dormant within the human spirit when it is pushed past the breaking point. It shows us that within the most powerless individual, there can exist a mind capable of outwitting, outplanning, and utterly destroying those who stand on their necks. It's a testament to the fact that you can enslave a man's body, but you can never truly own his mind. And a mind, when sharpened by grief, is the most dangerous weapon in the world. What do you believe happened to Ezekiel? Did he find peace in a life of freedom? Or was he forever a prisoner of what he had done? Leave your thoughts below. And there it is, the story of Ezekiel, a man who turned his pain into a fire that rewrote his world. This isn't just history. It's a reminder of the unbreakable power of the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. If this story gripped you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more forgotten tales that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past. Drop a comment below. Did Ezekiel find his freedom, or did the fire he set burn within him forever? Until next time, keep seeking the stories that history tried to bury.